Hi guys, are you ready to start revising and editing one of your papers? Well, I hope so because that's what your last assignment is, your last big assignment. Um, so let's talk a little bit about some things that you need to be looking for when proceeding through the revising and editing process. After this, sometime this week, you need to make sure and go to the formal paper checklist that we've been over it in class, but you can go over it's in your course files. And then I will also have a PowerPoint for you to go over some grammatical, mechanical types of things that everyone needs to pay attention to. So one of the first things that you need to remember in writing a formal academic paper is those two words. It's formal, it's academic. And so you're writing a paper for educational purposes. If you're writing a paper for educational purposes, you're not going to use everyday conversational language in your paper. That's just not going to be acceptable. If you're writing an editorial, a commentary, some sort of novel, you can use that sort of colloquial language, but not in an academic paper. Papers that are supposed to be educational, that are supposed to be academic, need to be written in formal language, not substandard English or slang. It needs to be nice, formal language. No trendy terms, no hyperbole. You can look at your formal paper checklist and look at some of the language issues that you need to deal with. But one of the ones that probably crops up more than any of them, and we've talked about this before, is using first and second person. It just should not happen in an academic paper, unless, of course, it's a direct quote. And that often does happen with direct quotes, and that's fine. You want to avoid it if you can, but if you can't work your way around that quote, if there's no way that your paraphrasing of the quote is going to get the message across that needs to be conveyed, then use the direct quote with the first or second person in it. For the most part, you want to avoid that. And when you do, you are removing the chance that you may be showing bias to your audience. And that's with first person. With second person, that's just informal. The word you is called the informal you for a reason. It's just an informal word. Even foreign languages have a more formal and an informal form of you. We just have the informal you in English, in America anyway. So you need to avoid first and second person. And keep in mind, first and second person includes I, me, my, myself, mine, and then all the plurals of those, we, our, ours, ourselves, us. So you need to avoid all of that. You're not talking about you. You need to leave you out of it, even if you're saying I think, I believe, etc. Which brings me to my next issue. You don't need to say I think, I believe. I'm under the impression that I have discovered. First of all, you're using the word I, and that's a no-no. But secondly, those are called weak qualifiers. Your audience is only concerned about facts, just the facts, man. That's from an old TV show. Only concerned with the facts. That's all your audience needs to be concerned with. They don't want to know what you think. They just want to know what the truth is. If it's what you think, then they're thinking that the way they think could be right as well. And that's when you've got that conflict that just is not going to be resolved. And remember, you're trying to be persuasive, so you need to do away with the weak qualifiers. If you say, I think that global warming is a big issue in the world today, leave off the I think and just say, global warming is an issue in the world today. You see the difference? It comes across as more, this is it. This is the truth. This is concrete. And now let me give you more information on the subject. You don't want to sound wishy-washy with the weak qualifiers. So those are some language issues that are dealing with academic. Here's some grammatical issues that everyone needs to really work on, and that is mixed construction, fragments, run-ons, and comma splices. Those are the four biggest grammatical problems that I see. And the fifth one actually would be agreement/parallelism. So the PowerPoint's going to deal with all of those, but let me just briefly kind of tell you what those are. So clearly, a fragment is just not a complete sentence. It may have a subject, it may have a verb or predicate, but if it's not a complete thought, it's still a fragment, okay? Oftentimes, words that start with those words like although, you forget the comma, and then you've kind of created a fragment. Another one is the comma splice / run-on. They're very similar in the problem, and that is two sentences don't have the correct division between the two sentences. A comma splice will have two complete sentences that should be separate, but they're divided by, they're separated only by a comma, which is not appropriate in the English language. In the English language, you have to have a stronger end mark. You either have to have a semicolon, or you have to, and that's only in certain situations, or you have to have a more solid end mark, like a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. And run-ons are simply when you don't have any of those. Comma splices are when you have used a comma instead of one of those. Those are very easy to fix. Fragments are pretty easy to fix. Mixed construction, not so much. Mixed construction is oftentimes a combination of problems, and that's one of the reasons it's called mixed construction. Sometimes it can be a sentence that if you fix one part of it, that may be a fragment, then you've caused a fragment somewhere else. Or if you fix a fragment, then you've caused a run-on. And I mean, it can be a big mess. Sometimes the fix is easy. Oftentimes it's a complete rewrite. And since sometimes it's kind of lengthy to explain them, sometimes I'll say mixed construction rewrite. And that just means it's a do-over. You need to figure out, what's making it not quite right, and then you need to figure out a way to fix it. This is stuff that you usually go over in Written Comp 1, but not always. Not every instructor chooses to do this. Sometimes they leave it up to the lab, or they just don't do it at all. I always have my classes go over the 5 major issues, and those are the ones we're talking about right now. So we've addressed fragments, run-ons, comma splices, and then mixed construction is what we're talking about now. Sometimes with mixed construction, the first part of the sentence doesn't match the end part of the sentence. And it's got to be fixed. You've got to make it to where that's balanced in some way. Now, balance, that kind of takes us into the fifth issue, which is parallelism / agreement. They're not the same, but they're problematic and about the same amount of time. So parallelism is when there is not basically equality throughout the sentence. So here's an example of a sentence that's not parallel. Today I'm going to go to the car wash, bathe my dog, and dancing with my spouse. And so you've got an infinitive, a gerund. And so, you've got, 2 plus 2 plus, and then an ing word. And so you can either make them all ing words, like I'm going, today I'm washing my car, bathing my dog, and dancing with my spouse. or I'm going to go to the car wash, bathe my dog, I'm going to bathe my dog, and I'm going to dance with my spouse. And so, it's not just a sentence where there's a series of things where there's not parallelism or where that issue can occur. But anytime you have, similar parts of a sentence, and it often occurs when there is a comma, and even if it's, like a sentence where there's just, the two parts, they need to balance out. They need to be similar in form. And so, if you have like a verbal, like a gerund, a participle, or an infinitive, you need to make sure if you use an infinitive in the first part of the sentence, that you're using an infinitive in the second part as well, or throughout, or however the sentence works. With agreement, and this is when someone has a problem with it, it's usually a big problem, and they usually have trouble with it from the beginning of the paper to the very end of the paper. Agreement deals with gender and number, but most of the time number. Actually, all the time number. But sometimes gender, plays a little bit of a role. The most common way that this is messed up in a paper is someone will say something like, every student needs to bring their book to class. Well, student is singular, there is plural, and so those two things don't match up. And so in that way, that's the reason I always kind of bring it in after parallelism, is because in a way that's also not parallel, because it's not parallel in number. But generally that's called an agreement issue. The number doesn't agree with the pronoun and its antecedent. So if you're talking about a singular student, then you need to refer that to that student every single time in the singular form. And that means with verbs and pronouns. And so you wouldn't put a plural verb with that singular student either. It would be singular student, singular pronoun, singular verbs, singular whatever else needs to go with it. You wouldn't say, all the students go to their class. It would be classes. Well, unless of course you're talking about them all going to one specific class. There then you just have to know what you're talking about. But you need to be really, really careful with that. So those are the 5 things that you need to watch. Agreement, dealing with gender and number, always number. Parallelism, making sure every part of your sentence is balanced with the other parts. And then fragments, run-ons, and comma splices, kind of self-explanatory there. And then mixed construction, which can oftentimes be a complete rewrite. And usually it happens because people just kind of get in a hurry and they don't realize that they've, the first part of the sentence doesn't really match up to what the last part is saying, and that sort of thing. You just have to really look over it. And the best way that you can notice these, that you can make sure your paper isn't riddled with them, is to proofread. Proofread it and do it out loud. Don't just read it to yourself again. We read it to ourselves all the time as we're working on it. Read it out loud. Listen to yourself say those words. This doesn't make sense. It makes sense. Or read it to someone else. You're with your families now, most of you are. Read it to mom, read it to dad, read it to grandma, brother, sister, whomever. They're going to be able to catch things, that you probably wouldn't. And so that's a great way to, to keep those things from really cropping up in your paper. Okay, I want you to go, and I want you to go through your whichever paper you want to revise and edit, and it does not matter which one, but you need to go right now or soon to the formal paper checklist. And I want you to go through every single line on that formal paper checklist and check your paper to it. Even if you think, I don't have stuff like that in my paper. I don't use hyperbole. I don't use the informal you. I don't use slang. Do it anyway, just because I said. And it's going to help you. You take a different color highlighter or a pen, pencil, whatever, and you read over and you mark those you mark those errors as you go, so that when you go back to start retyping it, fixing it on the computer, you don't have to hunt them down again. They're highlighted or already marked for you, and you can fix them more quickly. Okay. You also, of course, are going to need to work on adding a little bit of word count. You're going to need to add at least, most of you will need to add at least one more source, and you need to think of the best place to add that. You've got to make sure you've got an opposing view in your argumentative paper. And for those of you that had a really rough time not getting a thesis in there, got to get that thesis in there and make sure that you're actually writing an argumentative paper. Argumentative paper has to have a thesis that you're persuading. It can't just be a statement of fact. That's not a good thesis. It's got to be more than that. And then each of your paragraphs following then need to be the major claims and minor claims that support that thesis. And of course, your opposing view, your refute, your conclusion. So you could have anywhere from 6, 7, possibly 8 paragraphs, just depending on how much material. Try to stay away from that standard high school 5-paragraph essay. We don't do that in college. You need to get away from that. Argumentative papers, they can have more than 3 points. And quite frankly, if you're putting your opposing view in there like you should be, you should have more than 3. You would be having less than 3 points if you stuck to that 5-paragraph essay, because you've got your intro, your conclusion, your opposing view. That only leaves 2 major points for you to have in your paper. You need more than that for a good argumentative paper. Okay? So, take a look at the feedback that I gave you. I don't say those things lightly. I say it because I know it will help make your papers better. Certainly contact me, email me. We might even need to set up a Zoom meeting if you want to get into your paper in more depth. Until then, until our Wednesday Zoom meeting, I'll see you later. Bye.